Good morning. This is episode 3 of Were There Dinosaurs on Noah's Ark? And we're, uh, we're exploring the third and last installment. And the things that we're going to be talking about today presuppose that you've already seen the first two sections. I'm not going to do a huge review on those. We are bringing this to a close, and let's go ahead and get started. The question that I wanted to address today is this one. When we speak of prehistoric animals, we're speaking of animals that were alive, that did exist prior to recorded history. That's what prehistoric animals mean. Dinosaurs technically are lizards. Dinosaur. The word dinosaur is Latin for thunder lizard, or implying that this is a huge lizard. Obviously, not all prehistoric animals were lizards. Some of them were birds, some of them were mammals, some of them were fish, and on and on. So the idea that we call them prehistoric animals should be much more inclusive than merely the dinosaurs, which were the lizard variety of the prehistoric animals. Prehistory, for our purposes, as biblical Christians, literal biblical Christians, doesn't exist. Prehistory, is prior to Genesis 1:1, which happened 6,000 odd years ago. So for us, prehistory doesn't exist. Prehistory is only a fantasy, only a fiction created by evolutionary scientists as a means by which they can exclude God from the equation. This is, don't make any mistake about it, this is not true science. Evolution is not science. It is a religion, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that today. It's a faith that they hold. It's a flawed faith in a number of different ways, and we've seen that in the last two installments. Today we're going to see that come home with kind of a bang. But what we're coming to, what we're learning from this should be that evolution is a mythology that is embraced by the evolutionary community. Not all scientists embrace this, you should know. There are literally thousands of scientists holding degrees of PhD or better worldwide that are not just born-again Christians, but Jews that do embrace the book of Genesis as the only true history of man and what came before man in the days prior to man. Man and animals were created on the sixth day of creation, and so late in the creation act. But before this, there were several other specific animals created. I'm talking about the birds of the air, the flying creatures, and the insects and so forth. These were all created before man, and man was the final creation on day 6. And God saw that it was good. Now, don't fall into the trap. Creation scientists tend to unfortunately, creation scientists suffer from the same thing that the rest of the Christian church tends to suffer from, and that is hatred for Satan. The mantra of so many of these begins with, all good comes from above and all evil or bad comes from below. The idea is that anything bad that happens to me is Satan's fault. The problem with that is that we understand from a literal reading of Scripture that God is in control of all things, and His good presupposes our own. That is, pre-exists, and our good, our personal good, the things that we rely on or want to have happen to us, are secondary, extremely secondary to God's perfect plan, not for us, but for all of us. If a farmer is trying to raise crops at one end of a little town, and a carpenter is living on the other end of town, and he wants to do work on houses, otherwise neither one of them can make any money, rain becomes a real controversial issue. They're both praying about rain. The carpenter doesn't want any. Please don't let it rain, because I'm out of business for as long as it's raining. And the farmer on the other end of town is praying desperately, send rain, send rain, send rain. I've got to have rain, or my crops will burn up and I'll fail. I can't feed my family. I can't, please God, send me rain. So what does God do? And the answer is, God does what he always does, and that is, he does what is important to his plan, and not necessarily for the plans of those two men, because they're contradictory to each other. Nevertheless, God is in charge of the outcome. So if there is no rain, the carpenter's happy, the farmer is wringing his hands, but God is in control of his crops. And his crops can grow without rain. God is capable of that. So God is in control. Or, because there is no rain, and it's not just located in this village, perhaps there's going to be a dearth of crops available in the following year, and the prices will go up, and he'll probably make more money selling the few crops that he's able to harvest than he would have if he had been able to harvest the whole field. God is in control of the outcome. Now, all of this goes to the lengths, to the extreme of saying that God is in control of both the good and the bad. The things that we consider bad are bad for us personally. I hear all the time, I'm under spiritual attack. Under spiritual attack. People are always saying things like that. I've got spiritual attacks happening all around me, and I need prayer. I need help with these things. I need God's help. It never even occurs to these people that spiritual attacks might be coming from God. Might be coming from God. And that God is in control of the outcome regardless of where they come from. Gwenny and I were watching just the other day a video. It was a DMV video, one of these blood on the highway kinds of videos. And they were bemoaning the fact that this guy had inadvertently caused an automobile wreck that killed an Amish boy, and his family was writing a letter to him and absolving him from any responsibility because it's in God's hands. It was in God's hands. And although it was intended to be a heart-wrenching kind of a situation, watch your driving, in other words, you don't want this to happen to you kind of a thing. It was interesting to see that the Amish get it right. But Christians listening to this video would be wringing their hands. Regardless of what the Amish, we can dismiss the Amish anyway, but regardless of what the Amish think, isn't it terrible that this young boy whose life was just beginning would die in such a horrible accident? Let's stop calling these things accidents. There is no such thing. God is in control. So why do we even use the term accident? Why at a funeral do we say, oh, he was taken before his time? What a tragedy. Has it ever occurred to us as Christians that we are criticizing the will of God by saying such things? Why don't we see the hand of God in these things? Now, for a lot of Christians, it's never even occurred to them. If they see anyone's hand in these things, it's Satan, which has to offend God. Has to offend God. But for us, sitting here in this room, we know better. So when we see a video like that, we should immediately ascribe that to God. This should be muscle memory for us. Muscle memory is what the Marines teach the recruits in boot camp. The whole idea is when you're presented with a situation, you automatically do what it is that's necessary, and you don't even think about it. It's an unconscious kind of a thing. They do the same thing in a karate class. Given a specific situation, you're going to do, and it's like a dance, you know, you're going to do these things without a conscious thought. You're not going to have to think it through every time. That's how these things should be for us. As biblical Christians, recognizing that God is in control of all things all the time. He said so, not Steve. I didn't say that. God said that. He said, let me take a quick look around. Nope, there's no other God up here but me. I'm in control. And several times he goes to the extent of saying, and no one can deliver out of my hand. No one can take it away from my hand. I'm in control. Nobody can deliver out of my hand. We got to get with the program. If I repeat myself over and over again, I'm not doing anything differently than the drill instructor or the karate sensei is doing. What we're doing is over and over again, we're learning that God is in control so that when something happens, when we see a video, when we hear somebody at a funeral, we automatically recognize something as error. There's something wrong with this situation. We don't commiserate with them. If the opportunity presents itself, we could diplomatically explain that that's not a biblical stance. But whether we do or not, we need to be wise enough to recognize these situations for what they are, biblically, according to God's word, not man's. A lot of people will call this wisdom. A lot of other people will refer to this instead as discernment. When you can look at a situation and you immediately, without conscious thought, know whether it's right or wrong, and you will know what is right in that situation. That's discernment. And discernment is going to come by the Bible, God's word, and it's going to come by repetition. So if I repeat myself, get used to it. Okay, back to dinosaurs and prehistoric animals. Facts are facts. Prehistoric animals no longer exist, right? Wrong. Prehistoric animals are not prehistoric animals because all animals that exist today existed 6,000 years ago. Even the scientists would agree on this. Their idea, their concept of billions and billions of years of recorded history on the planet is not supported scripturally. Now, we can immediately dismiss billions and billions of years because the Bible doesn't support that. God's word gives us the genealogies. You've probably always wondered why it says Adam begat so-and-so when he was such and such a number of years old, and that boy begat such and such, and these lengthy and detailed genealogies all the way through the Old Testament and on. And then when we get to the New Testament, we see it all over again, specifically the genealogies of Jesus in both Matthew and Luke, the genealogies. So these genealogies are there for a reason. And I used to wonder, why do we have to study the genealogies? Well, fortunately, I didn't have to study the genealogies. Other people were doing that. They recognized, because of their own study, what the genealogies were there for. And that is, by looking at these genealogies, they can see that Adam had a son when he was such and such old. That boy, when he was such and such old, had a boy, and so forth, down through, and you can actually add all of these things up and get the age of creation. 4004 BC is how Bishop Ussher calculated it. Other people have come up with different numbers because they made different assumptions about the Old Testament, but they're always about 6,000 years ago. is when creation occurred, based on the Bible's account and the Bible's genealogy. So that's where we're coming from, a creation date of 6,000 odd years ago. And that's why we believe that, because God's word is the only truth in the universe, and that's the assumption we make going into a study of God's word. So there are no prehistoric animals, and that falls right in line with the concept of the dinosaurs, that is, actually the prehistoric animals, being aboard the ark. And they would have had to have been, otherwise they would not have survived the flood, except for the fish. The fish in the oceans, the saltwater fish, because there's a distinction, isn't there? If the flood was over the entire world, there was no freshwater lake or river or stream where a fish could exist. And we know today that there are very, very few animals that can exist in saltwater and also freshwater, and vice versa. So it's unlikely that fish as a whole weren't affected. But the saltwater oceans would have expanded to cover the entire world. And so things like sharks and whales and barracuda and all of the rest of these things would have survived the flood. Looking at the record, however, of extinction as it goes on, extinctions of various species of animals, different kinds of animals, seem to almost occur faster than the adaptation of other species into multiple species, different kinds. So when we look at the dog kind, it's still the dog kind, even though we think of a Chihuahua as completely different from a Great Dane, right? But they're still dogs. Now, we don't know how many kinds of dogs there were at creation, but maybe just one. And all of the rest of the dogs have come from interbreeding or adaptation to a certain climate, or they lived on the edge of a desert as opposed to on the edge of a mountain where there was snow almost all year round, kind of a thing, and so on. So we see extinction occurring. I know that there have been several animals in my lifetime that have gone extinct. Quite often, the extinction of an animal is bragged about by the evolutionists as proof that billions of years of evolution were necessary, because these animals existed in the fossil record, but they haven't existed for millions or billions of years, and we can prove that based on carbon dating of their fossils. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. The first thing that you want to understand is the Lazarus taxon. The Lazarus taxon is a technical term among biologists and evolutionists. They're talking about an animal, and it's interesting that the word Lazarus is used. The biblical Lazarus is being used in this case by evolutionists as indicative of an entire grouping of animals, the taxa or the taxon, an entire grouping of animals that have died off and come back from the dead. See, we weren't responsible. We didn't make any mistakes. We said they were extinct, and so obviously they were extinct. We didn't make a mistake. It was the animal that did this. Once again, the Apatosaurus, the lizard of deception kind of a thing. So the Lazarus taxon is a term used commonly by evolutionists to identify a group of animals that have come back from extinction. They were completely extinct. They were gone, sometimes for millions, hundreds of millions of years. And suddenly, they make a surprise appearance again. To believe that these animals suddenly came back from an extinction is the height of fantasy. What is obvious is that we thought they were extinct, But they weren't extinct. They were there all the time. We didn't know where to look. Or in many cases, and I'm talking, this Lazarus taxon is not just a few animals. This is thousands upon thousands of animals that they have suddenly, within the last 150 years, suddenly they have found thousands upon thousands of animals that are alive again. This is a huge thing, this Lazarus taxon. Everything from insects all the way up to huge animals. Huge animals. The woolly mammoth. The American Indian knows all about the woolly mammoth. They have stories of hunting them in North America, not in Africa. But of course that can't be, because that was a prehistoric animal. And man and prehistoric animals did not live together. The Lazarus taxon is a fascinating piece of work. It's either a fantasy or a fantasy that is chuckled at because they know in their heart of hearts that they made a mistake. These things were not extinct. They never were extinct. But of course we know all of them now, and yet not a year goes by that they don't find a few more. So that's what I wanted to look at. And these things are things that I have seen. Many of these things have happened during my lifetime. I'm not quite 200 years old yet, but I say 200 years because it's been about 200 years since the first fossil was discovered. Now, you may not recognize this, but it was early in the 1800s where we suddenly found fossils. Now, people had been finding fossils for thousands of years before this, but they didn't know what they were. They'd find a bone or a bone in rock or something like this, and they didn't recognize it as anything other than an animal, maybe an elephant's thigh bone or something like that. They recognized it as a bone, and they didn't know what it was. They didn't have a scientist around to tell them, and paleontology hadn't been invented as a science yet, so they just assumed that it was the bone of an animal that's still around today. That's kind of the approach that science takes to. All of the dinosaurs died off millions and millions of years ago. The current estimate is 68 million years ago is when the dinosaurs died out. And we're still arguing over what killed off the dinosaurs. We're gonna have an answer for you today. What killed off the dinosaurs? But let's look at this. This is a common scene in museums today. You can go to a lot of museums and see this particular scene. This is the evolution of the horse. The evolution of the horse across millions of years. Started out as a little teeny tiny thing there in the lower left-hand corner, and it evolved into the bigger one that's to the right of it, and ultimately to the next one to the right of that, and then ultimately to the larger one to the left upper, and finally into today's horse over there on the left-hand side. The fact is that all of these things, this whole thing is mythology, because all of these exist today, and yet they are still in museums with placards saying these died out, this one died out 40 million years ago, or this one died out 400 million years ago. They are still on display in museums. Nevertheless, all of them are found. Now, they go into great detail on this one over here on the far right-hand side, and that's what I wanted to focus on today. This is a dinosaur, the dark one right over here on the right-hand side. This is a dinosaur that they refer to as the Merychippus. No evidence exists that any such process as equine evolution ever took place. These are living animals. These are not horses, and they certainly are not the progenitors of or early examples of a horse. because they all lived at the same time together. How many of you have seen a Shetland pony? I mean, oops. Uh, but setting that aside, evolutionists say, no, these aren't just small horses, you understand, because this guy right here and its progenitors, evolutionary progenitors, had, in this case, this guy, the smallest one, all the way to the lower left corner there, had paws like a dog. It had paws with nails. This one was a large jump. Suddenly, it had toes that had receded so that they didn't quite touch the ground. Merychippus is a transitional form. It's an important step in the evolution of the horse because now its toes have receded. Its toes no longer touch the ground. They actually have been pulled back up on the higher part of the foot, and the remaining two toes have grown pads that represent the early formation of a hoof, which is clearly defined in the next step. So they make a big deal about the toes. The Merychippus is this guy right here, as I said, and they can point to the prehensile toes. The foot pad would leave a footprint like this. It's a kind of a cleft hoof, if you will, rather than a single hoof like today's horse. And so it was considered a transitional form in the evolution of the hoof. The Merychippus was, let's see, it was supposedly extinct 23 million years ago. It was suddenly discovered in 1901. Oops. We just didn't call it a Merychippus anymore. It was discovered in Africa and in the Amazon, and they called it the okapi. Suddenly, this picture, which usually is on the wall behind all of these fossil skeletons, has their dinosaur names given to them by paleontologists, of course. But all you have to do is change the name, which is something that we've been doing in this series, by the way. The unicorn was the monoclonius, and you just change the name, and suddenly you think, oops, somebody made a big mistake there. It was a mistake that was driven by the context of their own beliefs. That is, I have to make this billions or millions of years, so I'm going to assume an awful lot in the designation or the identification of this fossil that we just found. The Merychippus is, you can see by the drawing, has these prehensile toes kind of lifted off the side that don't make any sense anymore. The problem with that, and this is the artist's rendition of what the Merychippus probably looked like during its life, 30, 40 million years ago.
That same thing on the side. We've trimmed that toenail of the one that's up higher.
Well, these were actually toes. You can see them. There were actually bones involved, and it wasn't just a nail. It was just like a dog has a nail on the side of its foot too, which they would identify as an evolutionary kind of a thing. The problem with this is that this is how we saw the Merychippus even when I was a kid. Merychippus was an extinct horse. It was an important step in the evolution of the horse because of this foot thing. And this is the okapi. It was encountered first by scientists in 1901, but it was well known to the natives of the area because they and their fathers and their fathers' fathers had lived and hunted with these things. It's an interesting thing because it's not technically a horse. once again, we got a big oops here. They looked at the skeleton and they were able to positively identify this as the Merychippus. However, this okapi, this is a close-up of him feeding in the wild today. It's a giraffe. Isn't that something? It's got the stubby horns. It's got the long tongue. It's got the hooves of a giraffe, and it's got the short neck of a horse. They looked at the skeleton that they found in the dirt and said, oh, it's a transitional form of, it's equine. Oh my goodness, look at what we found. Proof of evolution. And it's not proof of evolution, it's oops. And of course, it's the fossil's fault. It's a Lazarus taxon, back from the dead. No, it was never dead. It was never extinct. And frankly, we were wrong when we called this a horse in the first place. And they are in museums, not museums, in zoos today. They were, they were in zoos while they still hadn't recognized them. So, what a stunning thing. The little horns, yes. Yeah. Well, what they have found is that some of these, like a giraffe, have cartilage horns. The cartilage horns would not have shown up in the fossils, in the same way that our nose is cartilage. In some cases, the imprint of the skull, or the head, if you will, was left in the rock. And they identified that as a different variety. But it was the same variety because what you had, of course, was a view of what the animal must have looked like with the horns. But since the skeleton didn't have those horns, this must be, they will take a plaster cast, and this is yet another dinosaur or prehistoric animal kind of a thing. Lazarus taxon. These are the two variations that you find. The larger white one down here, of course, is the plaster cast that they took from the hole left in the rock by the head, which was decomposed in layers of rock. The upper one is yet a different variety. The one that you usually saw in the old equine, if they had seen this, that's obviously not a horse. So it must be some other kind of animal, and so that's in a different part of the museum. So this is a back from the dead taxon. It's alive today, though. Oops. This is the king, or the queen, however you want to describe it, of the Lazarus taxon. The Lazarus taxon was first identified because of this fish. This is called the coelacanth. Say that 3 times fast. This is a fossil. It is dated 410 million years ago. It was believed to have been extinct since the end of the Cretaceous period. But on December 22nd, 1938, December 22nd, a specimen was found off the east coast of South Africa. And it was found in a fish market. The natives were selling it. You know, they caught this in their nets, so they were selling it in the fish market. Museum curator Marjorie Courtney Latimer discovered the fish among the catch of a local angler, Captain Hendrik Goosen. Rhodes University ichthyologist, that's a guy that studies fish, ichthyologist, J.L.B. Smith confirmed that the fish's importance with a famous telegram. He sent a cable to her in Africa, off the coast of Africa there is where it had been caught. She sent a description in word form, of this cable, and because he was a expert on fish, ichthyologist. That's what his field of study was. And she described it and measured it and all of these things. And he sent back a famous cable, most important, preserve the skeleton and the gills of the fish described. This is the picture that she had taken of the fish there in the meat market. It's huge, but this is nothing compared to a full grown. This is a baby, it turns out, and they're still around today. They're still alive and living, and it's not just one or two individuals. They're not even close to extinction. There are everywhere you look, kind of a thing. But this is the one that she saw. It had already begun to disintegrate, rot, the carcass. She captured it and had her picture taken with it a little bit later, and the ichthyologist said, preserve the skeleton and the gills. Skeleton and the gills are really important. This could be a major thing. He didn't know why at the time. It turned out that since 1938, this particular animal, this fish, has been found in Kenya and Tanzania and Mozambique, Madagascar, and they're all in the southern Africa area, but they're found all over the coast around southern Africa. This is the cable that she got back. Preserve the skeleton and the gills. And I think you can go to a museum and see a facsimile of this cable because it was such an important find. It was the first in a long line of Lazarus taxon. Now this is a picture of a diver swimming next to one today. This is an adult. They're big fish. 410 million years ago, this was extinct. And they came back to life again. Who would have thunk? And they're all over the place. Of course, they had a different name, but we can't be held responsible for somebody naming our skeleton something different than what we did. And it's alive today. Well, we're still calling it by its prehistoric animal name. The natives in different areas of South Africa all have different names for it. Most of them don't even have a name for it. It's just a big fish. Big fish. I showed you this slide last week. This is a Hindu demigod with four arms, and he's riding on the back. So he's obviously fiction. The assumption was that the monster that he was riding on the back of was also fiction. And evolutionists point at this, and they say, see, here's a perfect example of the fiction being held by so many in a religious context, a religious belief by the Hindus, of some animal that never really existed. They didn't find a skeleton of this thing, this animal. They had no fossil evidence that it ever existed, so they brushed it off until they found the real thing. Now it's alive today. It's called, a lot of people refer to this as the monitor lizard. This is also called it was discovered in 1910. These things are about 10 feet long and they weigh about 150 pounds. They're not huge lizards. I mean, not like an elephant or anything, not like what we would think of as a dinosaur. But they're still wandering around the islands, Galapagos and the Pacific Islands. These things are very docile. They've got a long tongue. It's a lizard. It's technically a true dinosaur. It makes a horrendous sound when it talks, when it speaks. It's got claws on it like you wouldn't believe. It's kind of a scary thing to see because of its size. It's bigger than an alligator, and it's wandering around on dry land. It's moving much faster than, say, a lizard or an alligator would on dry land. And he's not aquatic. He doesn't swim in the ocean. In Australia, they found these things in some of the South Pacific islands as well. And I've got kind of a unique picture. This is they've got the police department has a, it's one of their canine units is, I thought that was fun. But you can see the size of the animal. This is the biggest lizard that we know of living today. I say that we know of because there's evidence that there are bigger ones, and we just haven't, quote, discovered them yet. They aren't back from the dead until we discover them, of course. So this is alive today, even though we didn't even have a fossil evidence, and we had to kind of reverse ourselves when we said, well, that's just a myth, that guy riding on the back of that lizard. This is a common picture. The thing that made this so common was that sailors, ancient sailors, talked about sea monsters. The most common sea monster that they talked about was a long snake-like thing that was rising out of the water. I mean, its back, they talked about the riffles along its back. It didn't have any fins. It propelled itself with this long thing on the back. And they have it pictured here in this picture as hair kind of a thing, because that's what it looked like to the sailors that described this thing. Scared the living daylights out of them because it was longer than the ship was long. And that was a long ship, these big cutters that they were writing. And of course, people chalk this up to mythology. They've been drinking too much rum. They got into the rum, and then they started seeing things, and right up there with mermaids, and that was kind of added to by sailors who saw this thing and said that it had the head of a woman. It was kind of a female person. Its head was. This doesn't look like it. This just has the little horn on top, and maybe you can see the antenna that's supposedly coming out of its nostrils there. But this was a fanciful drawing made. Many of these have been made. You can see these in all kinds of ancient literature. These drawings, artists' renditions of what the sailors came back into port describing that they had seen out there on the ocean. Kind of a scary thing just because of its size. And not only was it real, it exists today. This is a picture of it sticking its head out of the water next to a reef. Now, you can almost see the face of a woman there, and the head, and the hair, and the rest of it. But the sailors obviously didn't get this close, nor did they have cameras. They didn't have iPhones back then, so they couldn't snap the picture, kind of a thing. This is called an oarfish. We call it an oarfish. This is, I was able to capture a video of this. The people on shore, this was at a beach here in Southern California, and they saw this thing laying in the water, and they didn't know what it was at first, and then they got a pole or something. You'll see it here on the video in a minute. They got a pole, and they were trying to get it out of the water to see what it was. It looked like some long piece of, and scared the living daylights out of it. It was not only an oarfish, but it was a live oarfish, and it started swimming around, and they filmed the whole thing from they call it a boogie board or something, kind of somebody was out on a boogie board with a camera, waterproof camera, and they were able to film this. So this is that video.
My God, look at the size of the thing.
Oh my gosh!
And I'm taking a movie of it.
I did it. That is enormous.
So are they trying to permanently beach themselves?
So she's paddling to keep up with it now. You see it's redheaded, it's got hair. You think mermaid, maybe, if they saw just the head part of it. Now, she got in the water now, and she's trying to follow it. It was moving slow enough that she could keep up with it. Isn't that something? And you can see the fin, the dorsal fin on the back. That's how it's propelling itself through the water, just like the sailors described. And it's got long arms down below. So now since they've stumbled across oarfish, this has become a much more common thing. People are discovering them all over the place. This is a picture taken in 1996. These are United States servicemen holding a 23-foot long giant oarfish found washed up on the shore near San Diego, California in September of 1996. Yeah, so it's recent. This one was washed up on shore. We don't know why they beach themselves or wash up on shore. A lot of people have suggested that they were laying eggs or all kinds of different things, but maybe it was just they were trying to get away from predators, and the beach was safer than the open water was for them because they don't move very fast, and they're big enough that they are a tasty morsel, I guess. But this is a big fish, and it looks like a serpent in the water. I remember one of the passages of the dragon, the sea dragons that were there were consistent with this. The monsters, the sea monsters that God created during the creation week. And this is alive today. In fact, they've got a very small example of the oarfish at the Los Angeles Museum. You can go down and actually see it. It's preserved in oil or something. But they have this big long table where you can go and actually see the whole oarfish, but it's not 23 feet long, obviously. They got themselves a baby. And then there's this one. Now, this is different. This was also described by sailors that they had seen, but this one was not as big. This one was scary because it had teeth. This one was shorter. It was a sea snake, but it was huge. And a lot of people thought, well, they just saw a moray eel or something like that. This was larger than an eel. It wasn't an eel. They made a big deal about this. And sometimes these things would start popping their heads out of the water in groups. And it was a scary kind of a thing to see these things coming up out of the ocean with bared teeth. Their mouths were always open rather than, and so it was kind of, you can imagine, it's kind of a scary thing. And of course, the scientists sloughed it off. This is until they actually found fossilized evidence that they believed to be perhaps the progenitor or some ancestor that may have matched this, and these were the bones that they found. I have a hard time figuring a sea snake, out of that, but that's then they started talking. Well, maybe there was a fish that they mistook as some kind of a snake that came up out of the water and bared its feet with its open mouth, and traveled in groups and stuff like this. And then in 1881, so it was about, not about 150 years ago, 1881, they discovered this thing swimming around in the ocean, and it's there today. They call it a frilled shark, because it's kind of a scary thing, and it is a shark. It is a fish, so to speak, rather than a snake. On the other hand, it looks like a snake. This is a photograph of it. You can see that it does have fins, and it is kind of a fishy thing. On the other hand, casual observers would describe this as serpentine. It's a snake-like kind of a thing. And it apparently always has its mouth open. And the reason they think that it has its mouth open is because it's eating plankton. So the frilled shark, and this is a picture of it, swimming with its mouth open. Yeah. Yeah. and it's about it's roughly the average size for these things is about 7 feet long. So it's not a huge thing. It's not like an oarfish was, but these things are swimming around in the ocean today. This is Lazarus taxon, and it's alive today. So this thing that they thought was a myth because they had not found any fossil evidence of anything even close to this thing. So they told the sailors that they must have been drinking, and so, but then they found the real thing. And it's not just animals. This is a 49 million year old branch of Metasequoia, recognized as a fossil years before it was discovered as living trees in China. So it's in July of 1943 is when this was discovered. Scientists traveling through eastern China, forestry official Zan Wang heard a tantalizing rumor, and he went to see this small group of trees that no one could identify, and so he went and traveled across Hubei province to find the mystery tree, and sure enough, when he found it, he clipped some branches off of it and took them back, and when they fully examined them, they were found to be these trees that had been fossils. They had fossils of, but they died out 49 million years ago. But they hadn't died out. They'd come back to life, obviously. So this is a Lazarus taxon of something that is alive today. Then we have the famous carcass this was brought up by a Japanese freighter. It was a fishing trawler. It had nets and out, and they were trying to catch a great big net full of tuna, which they did, but caught in the same net was this huge carcass. And the carcass they brought up, but it smelled terrible when they got it out of the water. Nobody could stand to be around it because of the smell. It was not, these were fishermen. They knew what fish smelled like, and they knew what rotting fish smelled like. The fact that they were horrified at the smell of this thing made them stop and take pictures of it. These are the two infamous pictures. They evolutionists were quick to point out that this was probably not what it looked like. But the Japanese scientists that had a chance to fiddle with what remained of the carcass when they finally got it back on land, said that it was a plesiosaur. A plesiosaur, a dinosaur that had been extinct for millions and millions of years. And they even issued a postage stamp in Japan with the carcass on it as a reminder of this huge find, this stunning defeat for modern evolutionary science. And of course, they fluffed it off. It simply hadn't been found yet. The fact that it was still a carcass and that it was a rotting carcass rather than a fossil means that this probably died in the ocean, and that's why it was caught in the net. Who knows if there are more of them down there that are still swimming around and were able to avoid the net. And that's what the Japanese scientists concluded. It was from these things. This was actually caught in the nets on April 25th, 1977. So it's a recent vintage kind of a thing. One of the, they called it Nessie. That was the nickname, Nessie. And when Nessie became public, a rash of horror flicks hit the Japanese market right behind us, starting with Godzilla. This is and of course you know the history of the Godzilla films. It was sequel after sequel after sequel, all kinds of different dinosaurs coming out of the ocean, kind of a thing, and Mothzilla and or whatever they called them back then. But they began to look seriously at this Lazarus taxon, and they found this little frilly insect. This is I don't have a designation on this yet, but this was they had fossil evidence of this thing, and it had died out millions of years ago, and they found this flying around in China. This is another one of the big oops kind of a thing. This is a hairy moth, and you don't see hairy moths. And this is a fairly large, apparently, a fairly large moth, kind of like a June bug size moth. And this is alive today. So they're not just fossils. And don't misunderstand me. They are fossils. They are millions of years old, but they're still flying around today. They didn't become extinct. They made a mistake. That's kind of the whole point of this. They keep making mistakes. So you have to wonder how we can believe what they say today about anything if they're making these kinds of mistakes. This is interesting. This is a little tiny lizard.
He survived cancer, outlived most of his species, and now he's a father at age 111. Henry the Tuatara is a rare native reptile, a species that resemble lizards and lives in New Zealand. With his girlfriend, 80-year-old Mildred, they are the proud parents of 11 babies, and his keepers are amazed. In March last year, a painful tumour was removed from the reptile's bottom. Henry's aggression disappeared, allowing him some time with the females. But Henry and Mildred won't be spending any time with their kids. This species typically sees them as a tasty meal.
So this is the only significance of this particular lizard is that it was millions of years ago. They were finding fossils that had been dated millions of years ago. The problem in all of this is not just that they're finding these things alive today. That's the Lazarus taxon. But the common thread, in case you haven't seen it, is the dating method that they're using to date the fossil evidence as millions or billions of years ago. The dating mechanism is flawed. Now, this is a Lazarus taxon. Once again, it's alive today. The horseshoe crab. When I was a kid, I saw fossils of this. The horseshoe crab was a famous weird-looking crab, Sometimes they were huge. They're around today. They've discovered them, and since you can buy them in a shell shop. You know, it's no big deal to find a horseshoe crab anymore. But when I was a kid, this was a prehistoric animal. Died out millions of years ago. Here's a picture of one on the beach. Kind of a weird looking thing, but this is the fossil that everybody knew and loved if you were into dinosaurs back then, and I was. So this is alive today. This is an interesting thing. This is called a Phoca capucina, and it's a prehistoric seal that they had found weird and conflicting bones or fossils of, and it's swimming around today, of course. And nobody would have recognized it based on its skin color. I mean, it looks like a leopard. And the weird thing on its top, they now realize that this is probably not so much a seal as it is an elephant rhinoceros, a variation of the elephant rhinoceros that we see down in Cambria when we go to visit Cambria. And this thing is kind of like the wattle that the elephant seals and the elephant walruses have. The poo-poo elephant seals. This is the cockroach. The cockroach is not technically speaking a Lazarus taxon because they've been around for a while and nobody thought they died away, unfortunately. But they have found fossils of the cockroach. There's one that he's crawling on over here. Fossils of the cockroach, which are dated at over 300 million years ago. So 300 million years ago, there were cockroaches around, and surprise, surprise, they are not only the exact same size as today's cockroaches, but they look exactly the same as today's cockroaches. There's been no evolution whatsoever. It's kind of like this fossil was made 4,000 years ago or something, you know. But of course, that can't be true. That can't be. So these are alive today, obviously, and nobody disputes that. The crocodile is a reptile that was living 200 million years ago and is confirmed as not only a fossil but a living animal today. And there have been no changes in the crocodile. The nautilus was also considered a prehistoric animal when I was a kid, and that has since that died out 300 million years ago. They have since found 30 of these creatures living and feeding and reproducing in exactly the same form in today's seas. The fossil shell up here at the top has been enhanced, as they do in museums, to kind of show you the possible color of them. Nobody had any idea that they were this bright orange color. But that fossil was dated at 146 million year old nautilus, and it's identical to the living versions of the nautilus today. This is a ginkgo tree. The ginkgo trees were living 125 million years ago. They all died out, of course, and all we had left was the fossil ginkgo tree leaf dating back about 125 million years. Next to it is the huge discovery, Lazarus taxon. They're alive and living in China. And this is the Australian and African lungfish. It's another example of a living fossil. I can remember the furor in evolutionary circles because the lungfish was identified immediately as a transitional form between aquatic and land animals. It was actually a water animal that had lungs, but it could still breathe in the water. So it was a lungfish, and they had examples of this from the fossil record that were 400 million years old, and it still thrives in the present. Darwin, Charles Darwin, the author of evolution, was astonished by the survival of these fish down to the present day. And in his Origin of the Species, he therefore refers to them as an anomalous form. That means these are outliers. We don't have to worry about them. The fact that they were around way back then, but still, we just discovered them, they're still swimming around today, that's just an anomaly, so we don't have to worry about this. The lungfish and all of these, and many, many more. All you got to do if you really wanted to get into this, and for the sake of time I decided we don't want to get into the depths of all of these. There are hundreds and hundreds of examples of these in YouTube videos, and you can Google Lazarus taxon and come up with gazillions, as you might think. So what we have is the question: if dinosaurs were still roaming the earth after the flood, how could the flood have been worldwide? And of course, the answer to that is they were on the ark. So the dinosaurs, except for the fish, they were on the ark. That's how they survived the flood. Now the flood is interesting in and of itself. I think I mentioned in an earlier episode that they've done a study of this. They've gone to cultures, old cultures, Polynesian cultures, and China and Japan, places that have a long history, and they have researched specifically the flood story. And what they found is that every culture has a flood story. And so what they did is they took down the best version of the flood story available to them from ancient records in each of these countries, and they compared them. And what they found was that in 88% of the flood stories in all of these different places, 88% there was a favored family. There's a family. There were 66 examples where this favored family was forewarned by a deity. The flood was due to the wickedness of man in 66% of the cases. The catastrophe was only a flood in 95% of the cases. It was a global flood in 95% of the cases. No mountains tall enough to break through the surface of this flood, global flood. In 70% of the cases, the survival was due to a boat of some kind. In Polynesia, it was an outrigger, of course, but it was a big enough outrigger that the whole family could get on this thing and survive this worldwide catastrophic flood. And that was 70% of the cases were a result of the boat. 67% of the cases were involved in saving animals as well. So the animals that were caught in the flood were destroyed, but their kinds were preserved in 67% of the cases on the boat itself. So it had to be big enough for the animals too. Did the animals play any part? Well, in 73% of the cases, this was true. And did survivors land on a mountain? And they did in 57% of the cases. Was the geography local? 82% identified the geography as local. Now, this means that their stories had the context of where they lived. So in Polynesia, this was a flood that was global, but it happened to in the context of Polynesian people, if you see what I'm saying. In China, the flood story happened to Chinese people. Their local geography dictated a lot of the details of the story, as you might imagine. Were birds sent out in only 35%, about 1/3 of the cases, birds were sent out. There was a rainbow mentioned in only 7% of the stories. Survivors offered a sacrifice in 13% of the stories, and in 9%, there were specifically 8 persons saved. If you take all of the stories together and put them all together and try to summarize all of the stories with a single paragraph, this is the paragraph that they came up with. Once there was a worldwide flood sent by God to judge the wickedness of man, but there was one righteous family that was forewarned of the coming flood. They built a boat on which they survived the flood along with the animals. As the flood ended, their boat landed on a high mountain, and they descended and repopulated the whole earth. Noah's flood. Noah's flood. Of course, and this is the commentary that goes with this, of course the story sounds much like the biblical story of the great flood of Noah's day. The most similar accounts are typically from Middle Eastern cultures, but surprisingly similar legends are found in South America and the Pacific Islands and elsewhere. None of these stories contain the beauty, clarity, and believable details given in the Bible, but each is meaningful to its own culture. Anthropologists will tell you that a myth is, often the faded memory of a real event. Details may have been added or lost or obscured in the telling and retelling, but the central kernel of truth remains. When two separate cultures have the same myth in their body of folklore, their ancestors must have experienced the same event, or they both descended from a common ancestral source that itself experienced the event. The only credible way to understand the widespread similarity of the flood legends is to recognize that all people living today, even though separated geographically, linguistically, and culturally, have descended from the few real people who survived a real global flood on a real boat that eventually landed on a real mountain, and their descendants now fill the globe, never to forget the real event. But of course, this is not the view of most modern scholars. They prefer to believe that something in our commonly evolved psyche, our psyche, which is commonly evolved, by the way. I think we're stretching the bounds of evolution a little bit when our psyche now is evolving as well. They prefer to believe that something in our commonly evolved psyche somehow forces each culture to invent the same imaginary flood legend with no basis in real history. Instead of scholarship, this is willful ignorance of the fact that the world that then existed perished, being flooded with water. 2 Peter 3:5-6. So it's an interesting thing that the flood was not just a worldwide flood. It is still held worldwide in the folklore of all ancient peoples. If the large and dangerous kinds of dinosaurs survived the flood on the ark, what finally killed them off? They were around after the flood. What finally killed them off? See, science is still trying to figure this out. They think maybe a huge asteroid hit the Earth. You've heard this. And wiped out all of the dinosaurs and all of the plant life and everything else. See, they've got a worldwide catastrophe too, don't they? It's interesting that theirs has got to be true, even though they don't have any evidence of this thing. Theirs has got to be true, but the worldwide flood, that's fiction. That's fiction. Hunters. And we have a long and glorious history of this in legend and in myth, where men went out to fight the dragons and that were terrorizing the populace of this or that town. Often they were knights, and St. George and the Dragon was perhaps the most famous and widespread legend of the heroes taking out the dinosaurs. But then we get to the whole process of carbon dating. Now, carbon dating is, as I had been talking about this, dating is always the problem. If you date a fossil to 300 million years ago, the problem when it resurfaces is that it's exactly the same today that it was 300 million years ago. So how exactly does this prove evolution? It's the same as it was. There has been no evolution. In all of these cases, it's the same animal. The dating is the problem. The dating is the problem. We often see this printed. This comes from a current textbook. Carbon dating fossils indicates that dinosaurs lived no more recently than about 65 million years ago. Carbon dating also shows that humans did not live that long ago. Now, this is being spoken of less dramatically than it usually is. This is a little bit more diplomacy in action. But the whole process, the whole point of this is that dinosaurs, prehistoric animals, and man did not live together. They estimate that human beings, came along about 2 million years ago. That means that dinosaurs died out 63 million years before men came along. 63 million years before men came along. The dinosaurs were gone. And this is a central tenet of evolution. If you destroy this, you destroy evolution. If dinosaurs were only created 6,000 years ago, why do we find carbon-dated, millions of years old fossils of them? And the answer is, we don't. We don't. And I could try to explain this, but I am not a scientist. I don't know the geology involved in all of this, so I've decided on a video. We've done this kind of thing before. So listen to this guy.
Let me explain how carbon dating is supposed to work, and then tell you the serious problems with it. Carbon dating was not invented until 1949, in the last 60 years. So when they started telling the kids the Earth is billions of years old, back in 1830, they didn't tell them because of carbon dating. They never thought of carbon dating, never been heard of, okay? Why were they teaching the Earth is billions of years old 160 years ago? Well, because they needed billions of years to make their theory look good. That's why. I mean, if I told you a frog could turn into a prince if you kiss it, you'd all say, well, it's a fairy tale. But if I told you, hey kids, the frog can turn to the prince if you wait billions of years. Oh, wow, maybe so. Now it becomes believable. No, it's still a fairy tale. It's a stupid idea. But the geologic column is where it all started. We covered that on video 4 and some more on video 6 about the geologic column. The Earth was divided up into layers: Cenozoic, Mesozoic, Paleozoic, Archeozoic. Each layer was assigned a name, an age, and an index fossil. We covered that on video 4. Then they said, now we have to prove these layers are old. So they picked the numbers out of the clear blue sky, and any dating technique that comes along, like carbon dating or any other, has to match the geologic column or it's rejected. Only because the geologic column's been taught for 180 years now. So surely it's true. Now, just because it's been taught 180 years doesn't make it true. But that's the logic those scientists will have. Well, we know the geologic column is established, therefore any carbon dates we get should match that. If they don't, we'll throw them out, and we'll keep testing till we do. They might have to test a sample 5 or 6 times till they get the number they want. Well, how do you know any of them are right then? If you're getting a different number every time, how would you know any of them are right? Radiometric dating would not have been feasible if the geologic column had not been erected first. Ever since William Smith at the beginning of the 19th century, fossils have been and still are the best and most accurate method of dating and correlating the rocks in which they occur. Apart from very modern examples, which really are archaeology, I can think of no cases of radioactive decay used to date fossils. They don't date fossils by carbon dating, they date them by their geologic position. That's how it's done. But here's what happens. Earth's atmosphere is about 100 miles thick. Space shuttle, in order to get free from friction, has to get up about 100 miles to be able outside the air. And, straight up, 100 miles is not that far from here to halfway to Tallahassee, But if you go up, look at the atmosphere, it has very distinct layers to it, which is kind of interesting. It has a heat sink where it gets very, very cold up about 7 or 8 miles up, like 80 or 90 or 100 below zero. But the Earth's atmosphere contains mostly nitrogen, 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen, a little bit of CO2 for plants to breathe. Well, these don't breathe it, they're fake, but plants breathe in carbon dioxide, And there's a very tiny little bit of radioactive carbon-14, 0.0000765%. This radioactive carbon-14 is different than regular carbon. It's produced by radiation striking the sun, striking the atmosphere. Sunlight strikes the atmosphere, slaps the nitrogen around, and turns it into carbon-14. So it all starts by the sunlight hitting the atmosphere. Just to give you the procedure here, about 21 pounds of carbon-14 is produced every year, and that is spread out all over the world. If I told you there's 21 pounds of gold, but it's spread out equally all over the world, forget it. I'm not even going to go look for it. Okay? You're not going to find it. Real tiny amounts. If you look at a periodic table, carbon and nitrogen are right next to each other. Nitrogen has an atomic weight of 14. Carbon has an atomic weight of 12. But if the sunlight slaps the nitrogen around, it'll knock a few things off of it, and it becomes carbon-14. So it still weighs as much as the nitrogen, but now it's considered a carbon. It's called radioactive, which does not mean it listens to the radio. It's just, it's unstable, and it's going to break apart. It's like three guys dating the same girl. That relationship's not going to last, okay, forever. Something will go wrong, right? I know what you want, Jonathan. Just marry her and be happy the rest of your life, right? Carbon-14 is unstable. It does not like being carbon-14. It wants to get out of this situation, so it breaks down. About half of it will break down on a statistical average. About half of it is going to fall apart every 5,700 years. Now, it is doing this on a purely random procedure. I mean, you got a pile of molecules. You never know which one's going to fall apart. But statistics tell us about half of them will fall apart every 5,700 years, roughly. Now, while it is carbon-14, it's floating around in the atmosphere, like the rest of the carbon, and it latches onto oxygen, like carbon often does, and becomes carbon dioxide. And they hook up, and they're happily floating around the atmosphere. And the plants are breathing in CO2. Animals come along and eat the plants. So the only way carbon-14 gets into the living world is from the atmosphere. It's produced by the sun, striking the atmosphere. Plants breathe it in. Animals eat the plants. Probably during your lifetime, you've either eaten plants or you've eaten animals that have eaten plants. How many have ever done that before? Like today for lunch, right? Okay. Everything we do is from one of those two sources. It's plants or animals that ate plants. Well, the plants are absorbing CO2. Some of it is radioactive. So if the atmosphere contains 0.0000765%, it is assumed that the plants also have 0.0000765%. Probably a reasonable assumption, and I don't argue with them. I just point out this is one of dozens of assumptions that can enter in to really mess up things like carbon dating. So probably you have 0.0000765% carbon in you, because you've been eating these plants or you've been eating the animals that have eaten the plants. So probably it's all balanced in nature. When the plant or animal dies, it stops eating, stops taking in more C14, it stops breathing. Okay? Now whatever it had is going to decay. It was decaying while it was alive, but now there's nothing to replace it. So what they do is they compare the amount of C14 in the fossil with the amount in the atmosphere and say, wow, this fossil's only got half as much. Therefore, it's been dead for one half-life, 5,700 years. Because it continues to decay after it died, but now it can't be replaced. So while it was alive, it should have had about 0.0000765%. If it's only got 0.0003825%, it's been dead for one half-life, or two half-lives, or three half-lives, etc. In theory, it never goes to zero. But for practical purposes, you can't measure beyond a certain amount. You know, you're going to run out of stuff to measure. It goes from a half to a fourth to an eighth to a 16th to not enough to measure. A great article came out from Institute for Creation Research. They're the ones that did the RATE project, ICR.org. They said, with their short 5,700-year half-life, no carbon-14 atom should exist in any carbon older than 250,000 years. It should all be gone. Yet it's proven impossible to find any natural source of carbon below the Ice Age that does not contain significant amounts of carbon-14. Even though such strata are supposed to be millions or billions of years old, conventional carbon-14 laboratories have been aware of this anomaly since the early 80s and have striven to eliminate it and are unable to account for it. Lately, the world's best such laboratory, which has learned during 2 decades of low C14 measurements how not to contaminate specimens externally, under contract to creationists, they confirmed such observations for coal samples and even for a dozen diamonds. I think what that means. The textbooks will tell you coal formed 250 million years ago in the Carboniferous era. And yet when they test coal, it still has carbon-14. How is that possible? If all the carbon-14 atoms would have disappeared in, say, 30, 40, 50,000 years, why would there still be carbon-14 atoms in coal? I got an idea. It's not 250,000 years old. Ooh, boy, they don't like that answer. They'll keep searching until they find another answer because they don't like that one for sure. And diamonds, which they say, formed millions and millions of years ago, they still have carbon-14 in them. And it's not possible to contaminate one of those things. I mean, it's the hardest substance we have. So how do you get carbon-14 in diamonds? And when did diamonds form? Well, I'm not sure when they formed. I know Superman makes them in a few minutes. Take a piece of coal, squeeze it, he's got a diamond to give to, what's their name, but olive oil. And so they've learned today, just in the last 20 years, I guess, how to make diamonds that are just indistinguishable from natural diamonds. High pressure. They've been doing it for years, making artificial diamonds, but they can't get them very big. Now, I think in 2005, they were able to get big diamonds with a synthetic process. Take your pet, that's right. Burn the body, cremate it, press it into a diamond. You can wear your dog the rest of your life, or your ex-wife, or whatever. We were talking about that on the radio yesterday. Anyway, the guy said these diamonds even have carbon-14. It says this cannot be contaminated. Those constitute very strong evidence the Earth is only thousands, not billions of years old. Now, the Rate Project book is difficult reading, heavy reading. Jonathan, you're awful smart. How far did you make it through the book? About halfway, and it's taken almost a year. Yeah, it's heavy reading. If you want the simplified, don't go down quite so deep version, this one is excellent by Donald DeYoung, Thousands, Not Billions. He kind of summarizes in real English what they said. Different ways to show it. Look, it's not billions of years old. But the carbon dating assumptions need to be pointed out. They'll say, well, we know carbon decays at a certain rate, and so we know if it's only got half as much, it's half as old. There's some assumptions that mess up everything. I'll show you how it works. If I said, we're going to fill a barrel with water. So I hand Leah the hose. Here, Leah, fill this barrel with water. But what you don't know is I have drilled holes in the barrel. While you're putting it in, the water's leaking out. It's kind of like your checkbook. You keep putting it in and it keeps leaking out someplace, right? How many discovered that as you live along? Got the ring, Jonathan? You're discovering now, right? Well, the Earth's atmosphere is kind of like this barrel. It's always getting brand new carbon-14, 21 pounds every year being put in. And it's always leaking out through decay. So the question would be, how long would it take to reach a stage called equilibrium? Now with a barrel, you can actually do the math and calculate. If I'm going to put in a certain amount of water per minute and a certain amount per minute leaks out, when will I reach equilibrium and where? That can all be calculated, with a little bit of math. And with the atmosphere, they said, well, when would the atmosphere reach equilibrium? So the guys who invented carbon dating in the late 40s said, I wonder about this Earth's atmosphere reaching equilibrium. They did a bunch of studies on that and said, now if we took a brand new planet Earth, created it from scratch, poof, got it going around the sun, how long would it take to reach this equilibrium point in the atmosphere where the production rate and the destruction rate is the same? And they determined it would take about 30,000 years to reach equilibrium. I'm not sure how they did all that. You could probably see some of the rate scientists and figure that out. But then they made two mistakes, in my totally unbiased opinion. They said, number one, we know the Earth is millions of years old. Mistake number one. Number two, they said we can ignore the equilibrium problem because we would have passed that point 30,000 years ago. They've discovered the Earth has still not reached equilibrium. Radiocarbon is still forming 30 to 40% faster than it's decaying. Now think about that. If radiocarbon is still forming faster than it's decaying, that means the Earth is less than 30,000 years old, number one. And number two, you can't carbon date anything. Because you'd have to know when it lived so that you could calculate when it lived. You would have to already know when it lived to figure how much carbon-14 was it breathing at that time. Doesn't work. There's a website, www.arky.org. He's got more stuff on the Earth has not reached equilibrium. If you want some articles there, by Ron Cooper. But this is a calibration curve. If an animal is still alive, it should give you about 16 clicks on your Geiger counter per minute per gram. If you're only getting 8, you say it's been through 1 half-life, or 4 collections, it's been through 2 half-lives, or 3 half-lives, etc. This is called a calibration curve. In theory, it sounds like it should work, but there are several real obvious assumptions, and I don't know how they don't see it. Suppose you walked into a room and I said, I want you to tell me, here's this candle burning on a table. When was it lit? Find out it's 7 inches tall. I said, well, that won't tell me anything. Now we've got to measure how fast it's burning. We measure the candle for a while. We get an Olympic stopwatch and we get it down to the nearest 40 bazillionths of a second. Okay? And we all agree the candle is burning an inch an hour. Here's our 2 facts. 7 inches tall, burning an inch an hour. When was it lit? Mary, can't figure it out? Nobody can figure it out. Unless you make some assumptions. Assumption number 1, how tall was the candle? And assumption number 2, has it always burned at the same rate? Neither of those can be known. If you find a fossil in the dirt, the amount of carbon can be measured, the rate of decay can be determined. I don't argue with either of those. How much was in it when it lived? I don't know. Has it always decayed at the same rate? I don't know. Has it been contaminated, sitting there in the ground for all these millions of years? There's no way to know those things.
He mentions several things that he doesn't go into explanations on because they're in other parts of this series that he's doing. Contamination comes up periodically. He's mentioned that a couple times. The contamination that he's talking about is kind of significant. The carbon that is in a dead animal, a carcass, or in bones, or in solid rock, for that matter, can literally be washed out. The danger is water. So especially seawater, salt water. If you soak a dead carcass in salt water in particular, it will literally leach the carbon-14 out of that carcass. But we don't have to worry about that as far as the evolutionists are concerned because there's never been a worldwide flood. If there had been a worldwide flood, then it would have taken any remaining carbon-14 in these dead carcasses, leached it out, and they would appear to be 30,000, 40,000, or 50,000 years old or more. But we couldn't measure it beyond that point anyway. So when somebody says, well, we've carbon dated this fossil and it's 200 million years old, first of all, even if there had been no flood, that's a lie. Because you can't go beyond 30 to 40,000 years back in carbon dating something with carbon-14. And you can't trust it anyway because there was a flood. And all of the carcasses that were destroyed in the flood were covered for a year with salt water. Poof. And that explains the kinds of readings that they're getting with the carbon dating method. Not millions and billions of years. And it's interesting. He started out by talking about the first fossils. He didn't mention that, but I did, I think. The first fossils were found in the early 1800s, and they recognized when they started finding skeletons that this was not an animal that already exists, and they went crazy. Fossil hunters were digging up their backyards trying to find big bones that they could sell to museums and paleontologists and all of this. They postulated at that time that the Earth was billions of years old. And they had to do that because of these bones that they were finding in their backyards and in what came to be known as the geological column. Before this happened, the people who didn't want God in their science, and that wasn't all scientists, mind you, that was only a small fraction of the scientists that were out there. They didn't want to have to figure God into their science. So what they did is they came up with, and this is before the 1800s now, this is what they believed. They believed in a thing that they called spontaneous generation. Now this is where life comes from. It doesn't come from billions of years. It's spontaneous. And they used as the model for spontaneous generation, and this was for hundreds of years they believed this. They watched a dead body, a mule dies, and they watch it, and within days there are maggots crawling around and flies buzzing around that weren't there before. They even did experiments to prove that this was the case. They took a carcass that was freshly dead, they put it in a dome, a glass kind of a dome, and it bred flies and maggots and stuff like that in there. It's interesting that Job, the book of Job, which is the oldest book in our Bible, it goes way back before Moses, talks about skin worms. And today, scientists know that you carry around the agent of your body's decay inside of you. It doesn't come from the outside. You carry it around with you. It isn't spontaneously generated, it's built in. I was fascinated when we were teaching the kids about the mountain and how when a tree falls in the forest, it doesn't litter the forest, because in most cases, with certain exceptions include the cedar tree, for instance. The cedar tree is amazing because, and that's what you line your closets with, you know, it keeps the moths and the bugs at bay, kind of a thing. But a cedar tree has built inside of it the agents of its own decay. You can go to the lumber yard and order a load of what they call pecky cedar. Sharon and I did this when we lived back in Pomona. We wanted to put pecky cedar paneling up, and it's paneling that is it's cedar. It's real nice woodsy kind of a thing, but it's got holes in it that have rotted through. This isn't because of an outside agent. It's built in to the fabric of the tree, and it begins to rot even though bugs don't like it. It begins to rot on its own. So God has built all of these mechanisms in. What they found, and these are the results of some common carbon dating, they found shells from living snails. They took a shell from a living snail and carbon dated at being 27,000 years old. Then they took a living mollusk shell. Mollusk would be kind of like a mussel shell in the ocean, kind of a thing. Living mollusk shells were dated up to 2,300 years old. A freshly killed seal was carbon dated as having died 1,300 years ago. One part of the Voloshevich mammoth carbon dated, and this is a famous mammoth, I mentioned him last time. He still has green in his stomach, you know, his last meal kind of a thing. They found that carcass frozen, and so they did a lot of studies on that. One part of this mammoth carbon dated at 29,500 years and another part at 44,000 years. So the same carcass was giving them dramatically different carbon dates. Material from layers where dinosaurs are found, carbon dated at 34,000 years old. Now what they do is they throw these results out because they don't match the geological column. And this is what they're talking about. This is the geological column and what they do with it. Down at the bottom, they've got these layers where hardly anything exists. Then you get up here into the Cambrian layer and you find basic sea animals. These are the sea animals that are crawling around on the ocean floor. They aren't fish swimming, you understand. They're the ones that are the bottom dwellers. And then as you go up this ladder, you begin to get the ones that are more mobile. not just the troglodytes, but the ocean lobsters and the different kinds of things. And the higher you go, you suddenly begin to see things that are able to move around through the water, not just along the bottom. And the higher you go, you start seeing more and more land animals. That happens here in the Triassic area. Now you're beginning to see animals that lived on the land in these things. And this continues as you go up. Now you can see dinosaur bones in here as you get higher and higher, and more recent stuff, according to their own estimation, all the way up to the top of the geological column. It has been pointed out to them in many cases that this is exactly what would have happened in the flood. If the flood was the breaking up of the deep, which is the way that Genesis describes it, as well as massive amounts of water coming down, what would have happened is that as the world was filling up with water and dirt coming off of every place and breaking up from the bottom, the first things buried at the very bottom of the pile underneath all of this water would have been those things least likely to escape. The troglodytes and all of the crawly things on the bottom. And as sediment continued to rain down underwater on the ocean bottoms, more and more things would be caught in the sediment that was raining down on them. And until you started seeing land animals finally, and they were being buried quickly, and you finally got all the way up, and then you'd start seeing human skeletons and things like that in there. This is an interesting problem for them, because the geological column is what they use to date things. Now, this is a real problem in the scientific community, and they recognize this, but they don't want to talk about it. He was talking about it in the video, but let me explain it a little bit more simply. When they find a skeleton or a skull or some kind of a dinosaur bone, they try to identify the layer of rock that it was found in. That tells them how old the fossil is. Okay, so if they find a Tyrannosaurus rex skeleton and it's in the Jurassic layer of rock, then they know that it was probably 200 million years old. If they find it in an older layer of rock, that means it's an older version of the Tyrannosaurus rex. Ooh, right? Or more recent. Oh my goodness, this one only lived so far, and this is how they date them. They don't use carbon-14 because carbon-14 doesn't go back more than 30,000 years. So this is how they date. Now, here's the problem. How do they know the Jurassic layer contains fossils that are 200 million years old? They know it, believe it or not, they know that that layer contains 200 million year old fossils by the fossils they find in it. See, they know that these fossils that they're finding here in this layer are 200 million years old. So that's how they know that the Jurassic, well, so basically the geological column, like the one that we see in the Grand Canyon, the geological column was laid down over billions of years. Where did all this dirt come from? I mean, there's only a fixed amount of dirt on the planet, right? I mean, where is all of this dirt coming from for all of these layers over billions of years? Well, let's don't worry about that right now. We'll get back to that one. Okay. They date the geological layer by the fossils that are found in it. But they date the fossils by which geologic layer they are found in. This is called circular reasoning. Circular reasoning. and it has no place in logic, let alone in science. In other words, we have to assume that this T-Rex skull is 200 million years old. That means that since you find them in the Jurassic layer must be 200 million years old, and therefore we can date the fossils we find there at 200 million years old. And believe it or not, this is how they're dating all of this stuff, because carbon dating only goes back 30 to 40,000 years. And carbon dating doesn't work if it's contaminated by salt water. Oops. Which is why they hate the idea of a worldwide flood. Now, this is the way flood geology works. For 1,654 years, that's how long it was from creation until Noah's flood. For 1,654 years, there was what we call pre-flood sediment being laid down. This is animals that died and fell. And by the way, just so that we're all on the same page, where are fossils being made today? Nowhere. Nowhere. Even in the ocean, when a fish in the ocean dies, what happens to it? Well, yeah, fish swim up and start tearing it apart, and the bones kind of fly all over the place, and some of them will even eat the bones, and it never makes it down to the bottom unless it's the refuse that none of the fish want. And when it gets covered with sand. In order for a fossil to become a fossil, it has to be in mud, and it has to be under intense pressure, like the pressure that makes a diamond out of coal. And that's just not happening at the bottom of the ocean. It lands on sand, and eventually it might be buried under more sand, but there's not enough pressure for it to actually calcify and become a fossil. So after a period of 300 years, it disintegrates into dust. That means that a fossil has to be made within a very short period of time. And that means a cataclysm, which of course they're not willing to accept. Because Noah and the flood, that's just mythology. So, pre-flood sediment for 1,654 years from creation to Noah's flood. Then we see ocean bottom dwellers. Now this all happens in the year 2350. All of this is happening at one time. This is the flood. The ocean bottom dwellers are covered with sand and dirt and mud as it falls down through the water column. The ocean bottom dwellers are covered first. Then the fish and the slow movers get caught, and they get buried on top of the layer with the slow movers, or with the ocean bottom dwellers. Then finally land vegetation and large animals and fast movers. And finally, then you see a period of 100 years approximately after the flood, where you see drainage from the land, draining off the carcasses of land animals that were left on the land. You can imagine when Noah and his family came down out of the ark, it wasn't a clean, fresh, pristine landscape. There were bodies and trees and plants and everything that had died a year ago. Yeah. Kind of puts you off your food, doesn't it? So the drainage and erosion would have washed a lot of these things into the oceans as they receded. And that probably went on for as much as 100 years. The stuff that was left would have been subject to post-flood glaciation. We would call it the Ice Age, or the scientists like to call it the Ice Age. This is an age where ice covered the ground and all. Well, it didn't cover the ground. It covered certain places, and it was because there were cold temperatures, cold enough to form ice there. And there are a number of reasons for this. We would acknowledge that there were glaciers forming, and the glaciers would have taken out an awful lot of these things too, these bodies and the fossils and the rest of them. So it was all done, the whole geologic column, if you will, was all laid down, except for the pre-flood sedimentation there, was all laid down in a period of about 100 years. Not 4 billion years, but 100 years. And that was only 2300 BC, 2350 BC is when that was, according to Scripture. So in summary, men and dinosaurs lived together at the same time. Fact. Even if we didn't want to believe Scripture as God's Word, the facts of science are plain. The Bible does not contain mythological creatures. It contains references to dinosaurs, which is what you would expect. At least some kinds of dinosaurs were aboard the ark. There was plenty of room on the ark for dinosaurs. The geological column is just flood sediment. Carbon dating is worthless because of the flood, because it's the contamination that everybody fears. You know how they've gone out into places like the Mojave Desert out here in California, and they'll dig around in the sand of this desert area, and they'll find seashells. You've heard about this. This is pretty common stuff, seashells. How did seashells get there? Well, at one time, this was probably some kind of a primeval lake. Or maybe the ocean, maybe the tectonic plates shifted. Or maybe there was a flood. This is the favored debate strategy of the evolutionists. I'm right, you're wrong, la 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 la, I can't hear you. Okay, so this is the debate strategy of the evolutionist. And you'll see this a lot. This is a lot. Did man and dinosaurs live at the same time? Yes. If dinosaurs coexisted with man, why doesn't the Bible mention them? It does. But if the Bible says man and dinosaurs coexisted, why doesn't secular history mention them too? It does. If dinosaurs were still roaming the earth after the flood, how could the flood have been worldwide? They were on the ark. If at least some dinosaurs survived the flood on the ark, what finally killed them off? Hunters. If dinosaurs were only created 6,000 years ago, why do we find carbon-dated million-year-old fossils of them? We don't. Were dinosaurs on Noah's Ark? Yes. And the evolutionary theory is not a fact, but a faith. That's why they call it the evolutionary theory. It's a religion by every definition of the word. They believe this tenaciously. They base their life as well as their view of the history of the world on this thing that they embrace as fact, that the earth is billions of years old and there is no God. Otherwise, the evolutionary theory doesn't have a leg to stand on. There never would have been an evolutionary theory unless there were men out there who did not want to acknowledge that God exists. And that's where we're going to leave it. We ran a little bit over time today, but the 3 sessions that we've had on this subject have been, I hope, instructive. They all sprout, they all come from the concept of the topical study of Scripture, starting with the unicorn. Next time we get together, unless I decide to get off on a topical study of the holidays, coincident with Easter. Next time we get together, I hope to begin a quick, brief study. Hopefully one session is all it'll take, one episode. And we'll study how to topically study Scripture. Reading through Scripture, studying Scripture through the Bible is pretty easy, and that's what everybody does. Topically is a little bit more difficult because it requires that you also use two tools, and we'll get into that next time we get together. Starting with Scripture and the use of two distinct tools available to us on all of our computers to boot, and included in some reasonably good Bibles, like this one here, which has a centerline cross-reference. Ha! And of course, Jeannie's Bible, which is the same thing. But yes, we'll talk about these things next time we get together, and hopefully, when this is all gone and behind us all, this little church of ours, you'll remember how important it is to study and the ability to study topically as well as through Scripture. Let's close in prayer. I love you, Lord, and I lift my voice to worship you, O my soul. Rejoice, take joy, my King, in what you hear. Let it be a sweet, sweet sound in your ear.